Hi, I'm Kaya.
And I'm Joanna.
And this is Starlit Citadel Reviews.
And Then We Held Hands is a cooperative abstract game about emotional balance from David Cherkop, Yannick Massa, and Ludo Creations.
In And Then We Held Hands, players are two people trying to repair a failing relationship by balancing their own emotions and how they relate to each other. It's a two-player game that lasts about 45 minutes.
Players begin And Then We Held Hands by placing the board between them and collecting 2 tokens of their color. 1 token is placed in the center of each player's emotional balance scale, and the other on the board node directly in front of it. Next, the emotion cards are shuffled, and each player draws 6 and lays them out in a row in front of them, with each card covering half of the one next to it, and a cover card covering half of the top card.
Players can look at all 6 cards before deciding which half of them will be covered. The objective cards are shuffled and sorted into 3 decks of 8 cards each. One of these is chosen as the starting deck, and its first card is placed face up on the table. Then the game begins.
On their turn, a player moves their token between nodes on the board by playing emotion cards from their row and their partner's row. Playing a card lets you move to an adjacent node with the same color as the visible colored line on the card. That card is discarded to your discard pile, regardless of where it came from.
Playing a card affects your emotional balance. You adjust your position on the balance scale to the right or left depending on the color that was played. If a move would shift your emotional balance off the end of the scale, you cannot make it. Players also cannot move through the same node twice in one turn or through another player's token. You can make as many moves as you'd like within these limits.
If you end your turn on a node matching the one depicted on the current objective, that objective is resolved and its card is discarded. If you end your turn with your emotional balance at 0, you may draw back up to 6 cards and add the new ones to your row.
Your board position affects your perspective. If you end up on the left side of the board, you may only see the left halves of your emotion cards. If you end up on the right, you may only see their right halves. A player on the center line of the board may choose which halves to use. At the end of their turn, a player must rearrange their row of emotion cards to match their current perspective.
Next, it's the other player's turn. They reveal a new objective if there isn't one already, and then they begin moving. If they can't make any valid moves at the start of their turn, the game ends immediately and the players lose. The players also cannot talk about what they're doing in the game. They can't discuss their strategy or how many moves or emotions they have left, or have any other kind of table talk. You don't have to play the game in silence, but you can't tell each other what you plan to do.
The first 8 objectives must be completed on the outer ring of the board, and players can only move on that ring. The second 8 objectives must be completed on the second ring of the board, and players can move between that ring and the outer ring. The last deck of 8 objectives must be completed on the innermost ring of the board, and players can at that point move freely among all 3 rings. After each deck of 8 objectives is completed, the player who has the largest discard pile shuffles that pile back into the emotion deck.
To win, the players must complete all of the objectives and then move into the center space on consecutive turns. You can enter that space by playing any one emotion card and traveling along one of the 4 paths from the center ring. Both players must also be in emotional balance when they enter the center in order to win.
The players lose if they get to the center while they're out of balance, or if they fail to enter the center on consecutive turns. They also lose if at the beginning of either player's turn they cannot make a valid move, or if they run out of emotion cards to play.
Some of the objective cards are marked with gray bars, which can be used for a harder arguments variant. Players can choose which gray-barred cards to treat as arguments based on the length of the bars and how difficult they want the game to be. So if the current objective is an argument, then both players have to land on the same node in order to complete it.
So I really liked And Then We Held Hands. I like abstract games, and this is a very unique abstract game because it's cooperative. It's the first game that we've ever seen that is cooperative and abstract. So really interesting, very unique. Also, this is truly cooperative because there isn't really the kind of situation where one player can take command of the game. That does happen in cooperative games quite a bit, and in this game there's really no opportunity for that to happen because you can't talk to each other about your strategy. So there's that communication ban which prevents one player from taking over. It means that everybody has to be focused on the game, everybody has to carry their weight, and both players have to work with each other and sort of stay focused on what the strategy is. It makes for a very interesting and truly cooperative experience. One thing that some players might find a bit strange about this game is the theme, for sure. It's a bit weird. It's about relationships and emotional intimacy. So if you're the kind of gamer who's not really used to that sort of soft theme or vulnerability maybe that's placed in a game, this might be a little off-putting for you. So maybe it's something to pay attention to depending on who you're going to be playing with or what group you're going to bring this game into.
Coming off of what Joanna said about the theme, my biggest challenge in this game was how some elements of that theme were incorporated into the gameplay. And that's specifically with the emotion cards. They're very well designed, they're clever. Each emotion is a combination of two of sort of the basic emotion of happiness, sadness, anger, and calm. So you get things like cold is angry and also calm, or manic is angry and happy at the same time. They make sense and they fit thematically that way. But the act of playing them is a little bit odd because you're trying to resolve an objective, you're trying to kind of deal with a big emotion and you use these smaller ones along the way. But if you end up being like ambivalent, carefree, and then ambivalent again, and that somehow gets you to happiness, it doesn't quite connect mechanically. And I found that I stumbled over that as I was playing the game. That being said, the theme is really beautifully integrated in the visual design of the game, and I really can't say enough good things about how visually this game has been designed. Not only is the art beautiful, it's done by Marie Cardois, who did the first couple of Dixit games, and you can definitely feel her kind of slightly surreal, very calming influence in all of the images. But it's also very carefully laid out so that it's very clear, it's very readable. There's not a lot of words, there's not a lot of language competency that needs to be involved in playing this game. And the designers have also taken great pains to make it accessible for players who are colorblind, which I always think is a really important touch. So you can tell that it's very thoughtfully and carefully laid out, and it's just a joy to look at. And probably my favorite mechanical element of this game is actually the difficulty curve. I love that as soon as you start adding arguments, it radically and quickly becomes very difficult, to the point where if you put all of them in, the rulebook actually tells you that that difficulty setting is impossible, which makes perfect sense thematically, because if you're trying to communicate with somebody, if you're trying to resolve a relationship and you're fighting all the time, it's not going to work very well. The very base game without the arguments is actually relatively easy to solve. And I like that. A lot of people like a more challenging cooperative game in order to kind of give it longevity. But thematically, it makes sense to me that if you're not fighting, if you're communicating, if you're really listening to each other, if you're really trusting your partner, you should be able to resolve things and you should be able to come to a positive conclusion. And I think it's really lovely that the game does that.
This game does not actually require that you hold hands, though it is encouraged.